Okay, today we're going to talk a little bit about questionnaire design. That is, how do you basically write questions and create a tool that enables you to measure things that you are interested in measuring. So what is a questionnaire first? It's basically a group of questions that are created as a tool and to get some data to basically make better decisions, right? So in our case, we're going to be creating a questionnaire because we are interested in gathering information about, for example, what consumers are willing to pay for a product, right? And whether they will actually buy it or at all or not, right? Now, whenever you're creating a tool to measure something, there are two very important aspects that you need to try to achieve. One is you're trying to make sure that whatever you get out of the questionnaire, whatever measures you get, they are actually reliable. Reliable means that if you repeat the same questions, people, on average, they will give you about the same answers. So reliability is essentially, is it repeatable or not? Okay. And then the second aspect is validity, which is, are you actually measuring what you're trying to measure or not? A good way to answer validity, or a good way to illustrate, better said, validity, is by thinking about what happens when you use the wrong tool, right? So for example, if I give you a measuring tape and you try to measure, for example, how heavy a bar of something is with a measuring tape, even though every time you measure that bar, you're going to get the same answer, so it's reliable, right? It replicates over and over again. It's not valid, right? Because what's happening is you are using the wrong tool. Now, in the case of physical world, we all know what kind of tools you need to use to measure different properties of physical things like weight or length, in this case, if you're using a measuring tape, right? But the same thing applies to questions that you use to measure something in the population, okay? So when you're trying to measure willingness to pay, you need to use the right questions to do so. Otherwise, it's akin to using a measuring tape to measure weight, which is not what we want, right? So the questions need to be reliable, meaning replicable over and over again, and they need to be valid, meaning that they are the right questions, essentially. We'll get to that a little bit more in detail in the next presentation when I kind of break down exactly what kind of question you should have. Good. Now, what makes a questionnaire a good questionnaire? Well, they are essentially two aspects that we're going to worry about, okay? Number one is, do we have the right information to make the decisions that we're interested in? Now, in our case, for this project, we're interested in generating some sort of demand estimate. And for that, we're going to need a set of ingredients or aspects, right? Like I was mentioning before, willingness to pay, for example, right? So unless you have all the ingredients for your recipe, you're not going to be able to get to the right answer, which is, is demand for my product sufficient or not, right? So you need to make sure that you have all the information that you need and only the information that you need. You don't want to have too many questions because people get tired, okay? Good. And the second question is the questionnaire appropriate for the respondent? Does it fit the respondent well? What this means is the respondent an appropriate source of information for our study, okay? So for example, if you're interested in questioning people that are of a certain age group, right? It's important that the answers that you record are only from people in that age group. So you're going to have some screener questions, as we will see later, to ensure this. Okay. Now, what kind of screen questions are you going to have? Well, it really depends on what the question that you're trying to answer is in general, but in particular, for our project, you're going to have to qualify the respondents and make sure that they fit the right demographic pattern, at least, and maybe the right usage pattern, right? So here you have an example of a screener question, something that will qualify the respondent to provide the answer or not. Okay, so for example, if you're interested in people that actually use a hair conditioner, right? it's actually useful to make sure that the people that are answering the questions are indeed using the product, because otherwise whatever opinions they give you may not be as informed, right? So what you will do is you will create a question that it's maybe not a content question or something that you want to know the answer to, but that will qualify or pre-qualify the respondent to make sure that they actually answer the right questions. So in this case, if you are using that product, then maybe you will provide a question that asks them about, what brands they like or how much are they willing to pay for that product or whatever. But if they are not actually using that product, then you'll ask them other questions, okay? Because maybe they are not knowledgeable about that product category, and because of that, you don't care what it is that they think, or even more importantly, it might not actually be the same group that you are interested in. Okay. Good. Now the whole process to develop a questionnaire is kind of lengthy. I'm going to focus mostly on point 4 here. So first, you're going to start with the objectives, what it is that you're trying to achieve. Second, make sure that you understand how you're going to collect data. In your case, you can collect data either physically, but given the whole COVID thing, that might actually be a little bit problematic. So you could go on campus and ask people to answer questions. Okay, so long as you maintain those 6 feet of distance between you and the potential respondents. Otherwise, you can go online. Okay, I'm going to assume that for the most part, everybody's going to do online data collection. Okay, and the kind of questions you're going to be able to ask or not ask online is slightly different than if it's, for example, on the phone. Okay, which I don't expect anybody doing that, but if you choose, you can. Okay, then after that, you're going to have to determine what kind of questions are you going to have. What is the format going to be? Then you're going to have to write specific questions, and that's what I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about today. And we'll have another presentation tomorrow where I will outline in more detail specific questions that are pertinent to your study. And this is a little bit more of a general process. Okay. Then after you decided your questions, you're going to go and look at the flow and overall layout of the questionnaire. And then, if this is within a firm, you're going to have to obtain approval, make sure that everybody is in agreement, that it's the right set of questions that you're interested in asking. And after that, you're going to do a quick, or maybe not so quick, it depends how lengthy the questionnaire is, pretest. Pretest is when you collect some data and make sure that you check that everything is working appropriately, and if there is some feedback about changes that need to be made, now is the time to make them. Finally, you prepare your final copy. This is what you're going to implement, and then finally, last step is to go ahead and conduct the survey. This is mostly common sense. Like I said, I'm going to spend most of the time talking about point number 4. Okay, so first, objectives. What are the objectives? What it is that you're trying to achieve? You're using this information that you're going to get from the questionnaire to make better decisions. In your case, your objective is to determine, at least, what is the demand for your new product. Okay, so you have a very clear objective. Could you have more objectives? If you are interested in learning something else, you want to throw a couple of other questions here, that's okay, but know upfront what it is that you're trying to achieve. Okay, to make sure that the data that you collect matches that. Okay, good. Then data collection method, I've already briefly mentioned. You probably want to do the survey online. I will explain how to do some of that in another video. But other data collection methods will be physically, doing an interview one-on-one. You can do that on campus so long as you maintain your 6 feet of distance, so you can ask people to just provide answers to your questions. Questionnaire is going to be short, and so hopefully people will be okay with it. I am expecting you to collect data mostly from family and friends. I don't expect you to make anything representative of what that product will be in a grander scheme of things. So we're going to keep it simple because it's a project for class, but I want you to learn the process. So if it comes down to it, you can actually do this in a more scientific fashion. Okay. Then you're going to have to pick the question format. What kind of questions are you going to ask? There are different types. The first question I have here, it's an open-ended question where you just ask a question and you don't have a restriction in terms of how they are going to answer. In fact, you allow them to just express their feelings or thoughts in an unstructured way. So what do you feel about buying Tide detergent? So people are going to tell you a story. Maybe I don't like it, I never do that, or they are going to be more detailed, tell you, well, I feel like it's a good product, but the difficulty is that it's expensive. So because of that, I only buy it for this use or whatever it is, right? So people are going to tell you a story, okay? And the difficulty with open-ended questions is that coding them is challenging, right? So how do you get something that you can use for analysis with a paragraph that somebody has written about a detergent? So you're going to have to come up with methods or tools that enable you to do that. There are some, but they are challenging in some ways and difficult to implement. We are not going to use, for the most part, open-ended questions in our class, okay? Not at least for this assignment. The other type of questions that you could have will be dichotomous questions. Dichotomous questions have two potential answers. You can see here a collection of 3 dichotomous questions. Do you own a laptop at home? Right? It's either yes or no. You either own it or you don't own it, right? Do you own a tablet? The same thing. You get the point. There are only 2 potential answers. This is why they are called dichotomous. Dichotomy is when there are 2 options. Okay. And then you have multiple choice questions. For example, what is your age? Here, instead of allowing you to write your age, what I've done is I'm giving you different choices. So I'm under 18, I'm between 18 and 24, etc., etc. So here you don't report specifically what your age is. What you do is you give me a bracket. Now, why will you do this? There are many reasons, but one of the reasons why people will use, for example, these age brackets instead of asking people for age is because some people might feel uncomfortable about telling you exactly what their age is, but they are okay giving you a range. And because you want to gather information instead of alienate and getting people unhappy about the kind of questions you're asking, sometimes you're better off getting a little bit less information, but have people willingly give it to you as opposed to just, people lie, right? So if I'm 40 and I don't want to let you know that I'm 40, I might just say I'm 35. By the way, I'm not 40, I'm 45, but don't tell anybody. Good. And within multiple choice questions, there are different types other than the one that I show you where you have age brackets. Here at the bottom, you have what is probably the most typically used multiple choice question. This is called a Likert scale. Likert. Okay, I'm gonna write it here. It doesn't matter, but Likert. Okay. I can't write very well on the screen, so sorry about that. This is an R, doesn't look like it, and a T. Okay. Now, these kind of questions, the nice thing is that you can use them for many aspects. All you need to do is write a sentence and ask people about how they agree or disagree with that sentence. So it can be used for measuring, for example, how people feel about a brand or about a product. What is their willingness to pay? You could ask, I'm willing to pay $100, and then ask them strongly agree to strongly disagree, for example. So you can use this question. It's a very versatile type of question to use all the time. Okay. One thing for you to be aware of, I put here 4 points for that Likert scale. They vary between strongly agree and strongly disagree. You could have 7, you could have 10, you could only have 3, that's fine, right? You need at least 2, right? And one thing for you to know is that it is actually important to determine the right range of values here. If you have too many, people just, focus only on the extremes and they don't use the middle points. So if you have 100 points, people are probably not going to use them. And if you only have 2, there is not enough variation in there for them to give you accurate information. 5 to 7, I will say, is a good range of values. So if you use a Likert scale, I would suggest between 5 and 7. Now, the most important aspect, I will say, of writing a questionnaire, and this is the hardest part, is writing the wording of your questions for obvious reasons, right? Because the questions are what's going to enable you to collect the information that you're interested in. Now, I have to tell you up front, writing good questions is hard. So I'm going to give you some tips, but these are not comprehensive. This is just a starting point. Okay. Now, let me start with some overarching ideas that are very important. First, as much as possible, use simple, plain English to write your questions. This means try not to use jargon, try not to use technical words, because you don't know who's going to be answering the question, so it needs to be understandable to everybody. So when you are in doubt, you are better off describing than just using a word that could actually be understood differently by different groups of people. Okay, so no jargon, simple, plain English, well written, hopefully, right? But explain and describe when necessary. I'll show you some examples later. What else? Very important. When you're writing the questions should be neutral. What do I mean by neutral? There should not be judgment or quality connotations to the question. So if I say, what do you think about the fantastic new iPhone? Well, what's going to happen is a lot of people, because you said fantastic in the question, they are going to move their evaluation of the product up, and they are going to do that subconsciously. So you don't want to have a connotation in the question that pushes the answers of your respondents one way or the other. They need to be neutral. Okay. Another thing that is very important also is to make sure that the respondents are actually able to answer questions. So if you're asking them about what happens years ago, it's probably, something that they forgot, right? So they need to be able to give you the information. Maybe they don't know the information altogether. Maybe they weren't there, right? And then finally, are they willing to give you the information? This is particularly important with things like age or income, where people might feel worried about divulging that information. And in situations like this, you're going to have to get a little bit more strategic about how you ask the questions. I already alluded to this when it comes down to age. We'll talk maybe a little bit about income later. Now, what is a good question? So first, you must ask the right questions, right? So what do I mean by this? Make sure that you only have questions that are necessary in the questionnaire. If you have too many questions, people get tired, okay? So it's very important that, yes, you have all the elements that you need for your decision-making criteria. In our case, it's gonna be, we need all the ingredients that we need to create a good demand estimate, at least, right? But we don't wanna have anything else, okay? Because it will tire respondents. So only the things we need to be there. Okay. Second, the respondents should be able to unequivocally understand what those questions mean. And this is tricky, okay, because we make a lot of assumptions. And I'm going to show you some bad examples of how not to do this and some ways of correcting that. Okay. And third, like I said before, respondents should be knowledgeable about the questions. This involves maybe some screener questions in the beginning to make sure that the person qualifies both in terms of the demographic profile that we're interested in, and or whether they have the knowledge to answer the question. Maybe they don't use the product category, maybe they don't buy it at all. So then why are we going to ask them about willingness to pay? They might not know, right? Good. And then finally, they should be willing to give those answers. And we're going to try to do a good job in making sure that they feel comfortable with the questions instead of maybe not be willing to divulge that information. So let's start with the beginning, right? Do they understand the questions properly? Well, here you have a question. Does your home have power conditioning equipment to protect your critical equipment against power fluctuations? This is a perfect question if you are an electrical engineer, because you know what these terms mean and you can maybe answer these questions. Where for the average person, it's very hard for them to know what it is that you mean. So this is what I was saying from the beginning. Try to use plain English. And if you're using any terms that are technical, you're better off explaining what you mean by power fluctuations. Okay. Here you have another example, right? Make sure that everybody understands the question, but also they understand it in the same way. This is a simple question. Everybody understands what is your income, but the problem is people might understand it in different ways. Why? Because what do you mean by income, right? Are you talking about pre-tax or post-tax income, right? Are you talking about me or are you talking about my household, right? Are you talking about this year or are you talking about last year? Are you talking about monthly or are you talking about yearly, right? The moment that you do not specify something, people are going to make assumptions. And if the assumptions of the people are different, and oftentimes they will be, you're going to get in trouble because you're going to be adding numbers that really don't belong together because people are understanding different things, right? So what do you need to do to solve this problem? Be specific, right? For example, in the past 6 months, has your household purchased any major appliances new from the store? This seems like a good beginning, right? Why? Because you specify time frame, okay? So that's when, okay? You also say who, the household. So not just me, but maybe also my wife, right? I have a wife, okay? And purchase what? Major appliances. Now, this is a little bit tricky, and this is, I think, where this question gets in trouble. It might not be everybody's in agreement as to what a major appliance is, okay? And then finally, new. This is important, right? Because you could be buying something off of Craigslist, for example. It might be used, okay? From the store. That's from where? Right? So this question is fairly good in the sense that it specifies a lot of the parameters that you need to know. You need to know when, where, who, and what, right? Those questions you should always think about and make sure how they apply to your question. Make sure that you're specific with them. Now, the only downside here, I will say, is this word major appliances. Not everybody might agree on to what these are, okay? How do you solve this? Be more specific. Right? So you start the question by saying, we consider the following items to be major appliances: refrigerators, kitchen ranges or ovens, microwave ovens, freezers, washing machines, dryers, room air conditioners, and television sets. So now you know exactly what I mean. Now, after I've explained to you what I mean, now let me ask you the same question. Now this question is fully specified. It tells you when, where, who, what, and exactly that what is define first, make sure that nobody is misunderstanding what it is that you want, okay? So this will be a much more specified and better written question than the one on top, okay? So like I said, specify who, what, when, where, and how. This depends on the question. Sometimes you don't need all of them, but at least think about all of them and make sure that you know you are on point. I already talked about income. What is your income? Bad question. Right? Not bad question because it's not simple. It's simple, plain English. The problem is, what do you mean by all these things? So in 2019, what was your total family income before taxes? Please count income from all members of your household and from all sources, including things like interest and dividends. So be very specific what it is that you mean by income, so that there's no, and what are you talking about? Are you talking before taxes, etc., etc.? So you see the point, right? The idea is be specific to make sure that everybody's understanding exactly what it is that you want, and because of that, they are not going to be making assumptions, because they will, okay, unless you say something. Okay. Now, how the answer should be given, like I said before, we're going to try not to use open-ended questions. So overall, how satisfied were you with the care you received at our hospital? Even this question could be maybe better specified, right? Because it doesn't say when. So maybe you should say the last time you went, you were at our hospital, because maybe you've been there multiple times, right? Maybe you need a time frame. But other than that, if you leave it like this, people are going to write a story, right? So maybe you're better off, unless that's what you want, specifying how they should answer. So maybe you have a scale that goes from very satisfied to not at all satisfied, right? So, and this scale, it enables them to always answer all respondents in the same way. That way you can aggregate those answers and do some analysis and find out what people think. Otherwise, they might tell you a story, it might be hard to quote. Okay, so specify the answers that are okay. Okay, this is very important, and it's a mistake I see quite a bit. Make sure that you do not have a double-barrel question. Double-barrel question is when you ask two things in one, and that's confusing, right? In the past 6 months, have you bought a television or a Blu-ray player? So if you buy one or the other or both, right? Do you get the same answer? Yeah, you do, right? So it's really not a good question. You should ask it as two separate questions. The moment that you have an and or an or, you probably are getting in trouble. So look for ands and ors in your question. Okay, and if you have some of those, consider splitting the questions into multiple questions. Okay. Now, another thing that we have talked about before is making sure that the people that are providing answers to you, they actually are knowledgeable about what you're interested in, and they are basically pre-qualified based on their characteristics. So start by qualifying respondents. Okay, how do you do that? Maybe you have some questions in the beginning to assess whether they are knowledgeable about the product category. Simple questions like, have you ever bought, I don't know, bubbly water, right? If you're gonna ask people about their willingness to pay about bubbly water, well, it might be worthwhile to know if they have any experience in the product category, because if they do, they are a lot more likely to be knowledgeable about it, okay? Like I said before, you can do the same thing. You can have screening questions up front for demographics if you're interested in a particular group of customers, like you probably should be, okay? Sometimes what happens is the questions you're asking are too difficult. Like, for example, tell me all the brands of bubbly water that you know. And if you leave it blank like that, people might only know like one or two brands, right? Maybe they say Perrier and La Croix, whatever it is, right? If you've ever had bubbly water, you know those are two brands. But if you have never had bubbly waters, whatever, right? So the difficulty is that's a hard task. If you just ask, blank question, then you write the answers. Now, an easier way is to actually provide options for them. So maybe you can ask them that first, and then have another question. Of course, make sure that they are not on the same screen, where you actually write down a bunch of different brands that are potentially bubbly water, and maybe also have others like Pepsi and Coke, to make sure that they are not just answering everything, and then ask them if they recognize any of them. And the reason why you do this is because it's a lot easier to pick things from a list than it is to recall the actual names of that set of, for example, brands in our case. Okay, so sometimes the task may be too difficult and people are just gonna freeze, so you might want to help them a little bit. Okay. Now, there is another aspect that you need to be super careful with. I already mentioned it, which is this idea of social desirability. If the person that you're interviewing or the person that is answering your web questionnaire, if they have an incline that whatever they are being asked about, you care about, and you will feel bad if they give you a negative rating about anything, they are just not going to do it, right? Although that varies by culture, but for the most part, people try to be polite. And because of that, if they have an incline about what your disposition is about something, they are not going to be as truthful as you're neutral about it. Okay. So, for example, do you feel, as many people do, that air pollution is a severe threat to our future? If you ask a question like this, what you're doing is you are telling people, hey, I think, as the interviewer, that air pollution is a severe threat. What do you think? Well, what are they going to do? Right? Unless they are very confrontational, and some people are, right? But I'm talking about the average responder. They're going to tone down their actual thoughts because the way you are asking the question is leading them into a certain answer. You need to be very careful and avoid this at all costs. In fact, this is why it's very important whenever you're looking at any polls or any surveys, you need to have the questions as they were asked in front of you, because sometimes you will find surprising results, and the reason why they are surprising is because the question is so leading in one way or the other that, of course, the answers are going to be skewed that way. Okay, you don't want skewed answers. You're trying to find out the truth. Okay, you can use the poll or the questionnaire to go with an agenda, but that's dishonest. You shouldn't do that, and it will bite you in your rear at some point. So don't do it. Okay, some people try, but it's just bad practice. Okay, one way of bypassing this is asking open-ended questions, right? How do you feel about air pollution? You leave it blank like that, right? And then they write a story, right? That's not leaning in any way, right? The downside of open-ended questions, like I said before, is that they're hard to code, and we're not going to use them. But this is a simple potential solution. Just try to write questions as neutral as you can. And then there are a few other aspects. I'm going to go quickly through this. First is, how do you set the questions? What is the layout that you need to use? Okay. So first, you should always have any screener questions that qualify the respondent. So if you only want to have answers from people that are 21 and over, because you're going to ask them about beer, well, you have a screener question about in the beginning, are you over 21? Right? And if they tell you no, then you dismiss them. You say, well, thanks for your help, but at this point, that's all the questions that I have for you, right? You might have multiple screener questions. That's okay, and the more screener questions you have, obviously, the more accurate the information is going to be, probably, but also the harder it's going to be to find respondents. So it's a trade-off. So only have the really important screener questions if you have any, okay? After you have a qualified respondent, what you're going to do is ask the easiest questions first, okay? And the most general. The reason why is because they are the ones that are going to make the person feel at ease with the task. If you ask hard questions in the beginning, and by hard I mean something they're going to have to think about a lot or that are hard to recall, people are going to get anxious and you're going to get poor quality of data. You don't want to do that. Okay, so general questions first. Okay, then in the middle of the questionnaire, you might only have 5 questions. In the middle of the questionnaire, it might be short, right? But sometimes questionnaires are long. So in the middle, what you do is you ask the questions that require a little bit more work, right? So if you have tasks where they need to evaluate a bunch of products, this is the place to do it, okay? And then finally, at the end, you might have the more sensitive information. And the reason why you put it at the end is twofold. One is because they might get upset and then not want to answer any more questions. So if you have it at the end, at least you have some information from the beginning. So that's a practical reason. But the second reason why is because if you've done this properly, and like I laid out here, people will feel more comfortable with the questionnaire because they've already done some of it. And they see that it's probably not threatening. And because of that, they might be more willing to provide information. Also, if the questions are potentially sensitive, you might want to provide a range of values instead of asking for the exact value, like income, and then people might be more willing to give you an answer that way. Okay. And then after you're done with your layout and you follow this format that I've discussed, obtain approval. In our case, you don't have to worry about that. I guess approval will be from your other teammates. Make sure that everybody agrees that is the right questionnaire. We are not going to do a pre-test because I'm only going to ask you guys to collect data once. But a pre-test typically will answer 30 to 100 people the questions, and also you will have some open-ended feedback at the end that will enable people to tell you, oh, the questionnaire is too long, or I couldn't understand the instructions for this, or I couldn't understand the instructions for that. Okay, then you'll prepare your final copy and then you go ahead and implement it. Okay, and that's all I have for you guys today in general. We will have another video with more specifics tomorrow.